You grew up in a world that didn't explain itself. No one sat you down and told you how to feel, how to process, how to cope. You just figured it out, quietly, on your own. And if you're part of Gen X, that probably sounds a little too familiar. You were the kid who came home to an empty house. The one who made your own snacks, finished your homework without reminders, and learned early that independence wasn't optional, it was expected. In fact, by the early 1990s, researchers were already noting a sharp rise in what they called latchkey kids, millions of children regularly returning to empty homes after school. It wasn't unusual. It was normal. And in that normal, something very specific formed. You became self-reliant, but also self-contained. You don't always say what you feel, not because you don't feel deeply, but because you learned early that emotions were something you handled privately. You watched adults deal with stress without talking about it. You saw vulnerability brushed aside. And without realizing it, you absorbed the message. Handle it. Don't make it a big deal. So you did. And you still do. You can be going through something heavy, something that would overwhelm most people. And from the outside, you look completely fine. Composed. Functional. Maybe even calm. But inside, it's layered. Because you didn't just grow up in a household. You grew up during a cultural shift. Technology was coming in, but it hadn't taken over yet. Conversations still happened face-to-face, but emotional conversations? Those were rare. There wasn't a language for what you were feeling, so you built your own. And sometimes, that language is silence. Picture this. You're sitting with someone you care about. They're sharing something emotional, something vulnerable. And you're listening, really listening. You understand more than they realize. You can feel what they're saying beneath the words. But when it's your turn, you pause. Not because you don't have anything to say, but because translating your internal world into words feels unnatural. You've spent years processing internally, making sense of things quietly. You don't reach for expression automatically. You reach for control. And this is where it gets deeper. What most people don't realize is that Gen X developed a kind of emotional independence that looks like strength, but often comes from adaptation. Psychologists studying attachment have found that people who grow up with less consistent emotional availability often lean toward what's called avoidant attachment, not because they don't need connection, but because they learned early not to depend on it. You didn't become low maintenance by accident. You became low maintenance because you had to be. You learned not to ask for too much, not to rely too heavily, not to expect constant reassurance. And over time, that turned into a personality trait. You're the one people describe as easygoing, chill, doesn't need much. But here's the part that often goes unnoticed. You needed things. You just learned not to show it. And that creates a quiet contradiction. Because on one hand, you take pride in your independence. You don't want to depend on anyone. You value your ability to handle things alone. It feels safe, predictable, controlled. But on the other hand, there's a part of you that wonders what it would have been like to be understood without having to explain yourself, to be supported without having to earn it, to be asked how you're doing, and actually answer honestly. And this is where it gets interesting. Gen X often sits in between two emotional worlds. You weren't raised with the emotional openness that came later, but you're aware enough to recognize its value. You see people expressing themselves more freely now, talking about boundaries, mental health, trauma. And part of you respects that, but another part of you feels disconnected from it. Because for you, opening up isn't just a decision. It's unfamiliar territory. You don't always trust it. Not because it's wrong, but because it wasn't your reality growing up. Vulnerability, to you, can feel like stepping outside of something that's kept you stable for years. And stability matters to you. You value consistency, loyalty, showing up, doing what needs to be done, even when no one is watching. You don't need recognition for it. In fact, sometimes attention feels uncomfortable. You'd rather be reliable than visible. And if you think about the culture you grew up in, it makes sense. This was the era of figure it out yourself. Movies, music, even advertising in the late 80s and 90s carried this quiet message of independence. No one was talking about emotional check-ins. You were expected to tough it out and keep moving. But here's the deeper layer. That same independence, that same emotional control, can sometimes make connection harder than it needs to be. Not impossible, just quieter. Because when you don't express your needs, people assume you don't have any. When you don't share what you're feeling, people assume you're unaffected. And over time, that can create a subtle distance, even in close relationships. Not because you don't care, but because you care in a way that isn't always obvious. You show it through actions, through presence, through consistency. You'll help someone move. Fix something they didn't even ask you to fix. Show up when it matters most. Stay when things get difficult. Your love is practical, steady, unspoken, but sometimes people miss it because they're listening for words and you're speaking through behavior. And this is where the psychology becomes something more than just observation. It becomes understanding, because nothing about the way you are is random. It's patterned, formed, shaped by a time where independence was expected, emotions were internalized, and resilience wasn't taught, it was lived. You adapted to your environment. You learned how to stand on your own, how to keep going without constant support, how to process without external validation. And that's not a flaw. That's a skill. But here's the quiet truth that doesn't get said enough. You don't have to carry everything alone anymore. Not because you're incapable, but because you were never meant to. There's a difference. And recognizing that doesn't take away your strength. It expands it. Because real strength isn't just about handling everything by yourself. It's about knowing when you don't have to. And maybe that's the shift. Not becoming someone completely different, but allowing yourself to soften in small ways. To say a little more than you usually would. To let someone see a part of you that you've kept private for years. Not all at once. Just a little. Because you've already proven you can survive on your own. That part is clear. The question now is something deeper. Can you let yourself be understood without feeling like you're losing control? Can you receive without feeling like you owe something in return? And can you accept that the way you became strong doesn't have to be the only way you stay strong? Because the psychology of Gen X isn't just about independence. It's about quiet resilience, adaptation, and a kind of emotional depth that doesn't always announce itself, but is always there. And maybe, just maybe, it's time for that depth to be seen, even if only a little more than before. If any part of this felt familiar, not just understood, but recognized, then you already know there's more beneath the surface than people usually see. And sometimes, simply acknowledging that is where everything starts to shift. If this resonated with you, this channel explores the psychology behind the parts of yourself you have always felt, but could not always explain. Subscribe if you want more videos like this. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, share this with them. Sometimes the most comforting thing is realizing you were never the only one.